So I've asked the four speakers to speak for 10 minutes, first of all, about their views on this, and then it'll be open for a discussion from the floor. So the order of the speakers, you all have the bios somewhere, so I won't go through them all because we'll be here all day. So first of all, I'd like to say ladies first, and there was some sort of gentlemanly spirit, but she was the one most courageous to say yes, I want to go first. So there's one for woman power. So Giulia Laurie from the City University, just up the road in the city, in London. And then Eric Beinhocker from Oxford University. And then, now it's an interesting choice, you're both asked to go last. Oh. So Doyne Farmer's going to go, well, yes, Doyne Farmer third. And then Kumar, if I can ask you to go fourth as a policymaker of a slightly different dimension from the Foreign Office. But we've spoken before about how some of these issues would be very helpful in your sort of work. So I think that'd be a nice order. Yeah. So, Giulia, you have 10 minutes, and the two who have just arrived. This is going to be 2 minutes left, and that means you've got no time left. Okay, and I'm the timekeeper. Right.
Thank you. So I've been here not for the whole day, but quite a bit of it, and so many times this morning has been mentioned what a complex system is, which is a system made up of a number of heterogeneous parts that react and adapt to each other and to the system and to the environment that they create. And when we try to apply this kind of thinking in economics, an obvious place where this complex dynamics arise is at the point when the agents make expectation, which was in fact very much discussed this afternoon. And if you what I thought about, I could say a little bit to complement what has already been mentioned today, is understand how this process of making expectation by responding and learning through this recursive process where the agents learn from the variables they themselves have created may then be relevant for policies related to transparency. Okay, so I wanted to mention a couple of examples of regulatory policies on transparencies of market. I have been working mostly in financial markets, but I think this is relevant for markets in general, so that's why I thought about this particular applications. And as Alan has been saying before, having heterogeneous expectations in itself is not necessarily a problem. In fact, it normally is not a problem. The problem is whether there are coordination mechanisms that create correlation on the expectations of the agents. And this can lead to two different problems. At one level, having agents coordinating on a particular action may create this fat tail distribution in outcomes that we often observe in complex systems, but at the other level may also create the problem that agents, by trying to learn from the observed variables, they may not necessarily learn true information if the behavior of agents is driven itself by noisy information. So if you have agents who have noisy signals and you're trying to herd on their behavior, trying to learn what they are doing, you may actually end up acting on noise rather than acting on the signal. So if that is the situation, having markets which are more transparent may actually not necessarily help the process of information discovery. And that's precisely the situation we have been looking at. So at one level, we studied the role of market transparency in terms of allowing or not traders to use iceberg orders in a stock market. And so this has been introduced in markets because regulators are worried that markets prices can be manipulated by agents, by traders who place some fictitious orders, normally quite far away from the traded price, to try and induce expectations on the agents, and then very quickly they cancel this order and they trade on the opposite side of the market. So to try and avoid this kind of behavior, normally there are two approaches that real markets have used. In some markets, they only show part of the limit order book, which is the queue system where all the orders are accumulated, and normally they show the best 5 quotes on the buy and the sell side of the market. Other markets instead have used the possibility for traders to hide part of their orders and reveal only the peak, and as the peak is executed, the rest of the order becomes visible a little bit at the time. And there has been a lot of concern about iceberg order and a demand to eliminate these market orders. There has been a lot of empirical research, theoretical research. Empirically, there isn't enough observations. Theoretically, the models are too simplified, so it's difficult to capture the effect of this mechanism. So what we decided to do is to compare these two mechanisms, these two regulatory frameworks in an agent-based model. And what we think is that so at least that's the assumption we make, is that when agents trade, they respond, they combine two different signals. They combine their own private signal, but they also look at the book. And if there is an imbalance in the book and there is many more orders to buy than to sell, they use this imbalance to make expectations. So, but what happens, and so you would expect that, normally you would expect that if they were only trading on their own private signal, more information would obviously be better. But because they are coordinating their action, by the imbalance in the limit order book is creating this coordination in their actions, then what happens basically is that if the agents see this imbalance, they expect prices to go up. And if they expect prices to go up, they will either want to buy, and they want to buy straight away to then capitalize on the price increase. So they normally want to buy by placing very aggressive orders. Or they want to sell, and if they want to sell, they don't want to sell at the current price. They want to sell at a higher price. So they will normally place a less aggressive order through a limit order. So this creates an imbalance in the limit order book, with the buy order all concentrated very close to the midpoint, and the sell order spread into the book. So if you now create a regulatory framework where you only show the quotes at the best, close to the midpoint, the imbalance goes higher up because you don't see the tail of the sell order, which are farther away. So this has actually a negative effect on the forecasting behavior of the agents. So while if you allow the agents to endogenously choose to hide the size of the order, what we find is that market quality is a lot better. So that's an example. Another example we looked at is there has been, after the financial crisis, a lot of concern about over-the-counter market, because over-the-counter market are non-transparent and the agents cannot observe the price which is traded at different places in the market, because the prices are negotiated privately. And there has been a call to trade derivatives, for example, in centralized market exchanges. So what we wanted to understand is whether it is, always the case that a more centralized market is preferable in terms, for example, of efficiency, so in terms of aggregating information. So, and normally the debate is around the fact that, if agents again are trading on true signals, then a more connected market, because information percolates through the markets, the more connected, the faster the information percolates, and the faster you would expect the true signal to be reflected into the price. However, if agents are trying to learn from the others, and if the agents are not perfectly informed, but there is noise again in this information, what we actually find is that sometimes agents who have the wrong expectation may generate these misinformation cascades in the system. And these misinformation cascades are a lot more important when markets are fully connected and markets are less connected. So what's the point of mentioning all this? That first of all, this complex system have a very can generate dynamics which are really not intuitive, and then when we're trying to make policy, this non-intuitive behavior, these unintended consequences of the policy it becomes very important to understand better. And the behavior of this system cannot really predict it in advance, but it can only be predicted through the dynamic they generate. So it's very difficult to think about policies that can be decided up front. And as this system are adaptive, the policies need to adapt themselves, and is a more a trial and error type of approach to policy that emerges as perhaps more appropriate in this kind of setting, because also the behavior of the system will depend very much on the assumptions about how well informed, how much information there is in the system, how much traders may imitate on each other, and this is something which is very difficult to predict ex ante. So it's only letting the system evolve and trying a policy and see what the response of the system is, and then adjusting it if the behavior is not the one that was desirable. So having a more experimental approach to policy, I think, is one of the messages that comes out of complexity.
Thank you, Angus, and also thanks to Rebuilding Macro for hosting this event, and apologies I couldn't be here for the earlier sessions. I think Giulia's examples give a great argument for why we need these approaches in policy. We have questions in policy where more traditional approaches may either get us the wrong answer, or I'm going to talk about some examples where they don't even know how to ask the question, or can't get at the question that the policymakers really want to ask. And the example I'm going to briefly talk about is an issue that cuts across both micro and macro, which is wages. One of the main, a big challenge for many developed countries has been wage stagnation. We've seen this across many OECD economies, most notably in the US. Just to give you a headline statistic, the average in the bottom 90% of households in the US was earning the same in real terms in 2017 as they were in 1973. So that's how long the wage stagnation has been going on for the broad kind of middle of the US. Not quite as severe in the UK, but the UK has also had a wage stagnation issue. And so, it's a hot area of policy debate about, now that we understand this, what do we do about it, in a variety of policy tools that people look to, including the minimum wage is seen as one key policy tool for addressing this issue. Now, the simplistic kind of Econ 101 view on the minimum wage is that if we mandate a rise in wages, that increases the cost of labor, and so there's going to be less demand for labor, and will create a negative side effect of increased unemployment. Now, we've known for quite a while now that that's just simply not true. The pioneering work that was done by Alan Kruger and many since have shown quite conclusively that increases in the minimum wage don't have these negative employment effects. They have either very, very small effects on unemployment, but they do tend to have actually quite positive effects on wages. The main impact has been that lower income households get more money. And there also appear to be some other kind of spillover benefits in terms of continuity of employment and lower dependence on government benefits and welfare and other things. And there's also been some observations about improvements in productivity as well. So we've got a pretty big body of empirical evidence saying something is going on here that's different from the Econ 101 kind of intuition, and a bunch of interesting hypotheses on what those factors might be. But to date, there's been no way to kind of pull that data and these hypotheses together into any coherent model. And the existing models that policymakers have tend to either be econometric models, where you can get some useful estimations of wage elasticities and things like that, but they're very limited in what you can use them for. Or we have the kind of standard equilibrium models where they're the way they're designed, you have to get the Econ 101 answer. That's the only answer that can come out of the model because they have to resolve to, full employment equilibrium at some point. Now, there's been an approach to try to introduce more frictions to these models to, make them somewhat more realistic. But at the end of the day, they're structurally designed to kind of pre-bake the answer of this has to be bad for unemployment, even though, again, the data doesn't say that. So what we'd ideally like is a more realistic model that brings in the kind of institutional realism of the type that Giulia talked about in her market models that can aggregate households up and look at the macro picture. So you could imagine a model with heterogeneous agents of households with different levels of income, working in different sectors and geographies. And having that heterogeneity is important both as a kind of input into the model, because again, policy like the minimum wage may affect different income groups differently or even different geographies. Minimum wage in the north of England might look different than in London, for example, so geography may be important, but also as outputs of the model, because some of the key questions you want to ask are not just what's happening to wages and employment at an aggregate level, but you want to know how is the policy affecting these households or those households or this region or that region, the kind of political economy questions. You'd also like the model to be able to test some of these hypotheses about the dynamics that seem to come out of the data. So, for example, looking at the connection between wages and productivity as a two-way feedback, not just one way, like you see in the econometric models. Also, feedbacks between wages, taxes, and government benefits. Again, the dynamic that as people's incomes go up, they pay more taxes and less dependency on government benefits. And then also connections between wages, demand, and growth. People have more money to spend in the economy. That has some, stimulative effect. And there's evidence that that happens actually quite geographically concentrated, that in lower income neighborhoods, those higher wages get spent in those neighborhoods. And then also you'd like to have some realism in your institutions, labor market frictions, how hard it is to hire and fire people, time for job search and things like that. And maybe you might also want to have some realistic behavior in there as well, that people have imperfect information and things like that. If you combine these things together, you can imagine a kind of policy flight simulator that would allow you to, explore a number of hypotheses about, what level. We know that higher minimum wages that we've seen to date have had positive impacts, but at some point there probably is a trade-off, a curve. If we raise the wage to $100 an hour, something's going to happen. So, and to allow you also to compare the effectiveness of this policy to other labor market policies that might be aimed at raising wages. So just to wrap up, I would argue that issues around labor markets, inequality, wages, these are kind of a killer app for these types of modeling approaches and the complexity approach, because it's very hard to get at the issues that the policymakers are really interested in with the more standard approaches.
Thank you very much, Steve.
How many minutes do we have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
This is going to be 8.
Good. All right. So I guess I'm going to just try and reflect on the day and what I think the lessons are for us complexity economics people and the profession as a whole. So first of all, I think it was a remarkable benchmark to have Alex Brazier, who has he's like head of financial stability.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a pretty important title for, the first or second most important central bank in the world, probably, to say like 6 times today, we need simulations. Simulations are what tell us the answers to these questions. Saying things like, I want to model the whole financial system, and I don't think he meant a little tinker toy model. I think he means a granular model that really has the balance sheets of real banks in it. And that's pretty amazing. That's a hurdle. We've been plugging away at this for 25 years or something now, and now, it's happening. Now, I think it's also a point where we can have debates among ourselves about what the most productive thing to do is. And, even maybe better, we just have heterogeneity with different approaches. Different people accomplish different things. So on that note, I think I would disagree, or let's say I just have a different opinion than Andrea does. I mean, I really like your model. I really like the fact that you're able to, you've got a complete model, you can do all these experiments, you can really, robustly say that within the confines of your model and a bunch of variations on it, that austerity sucks. And so that's good. But, one could worry. I mean, the model is sort of a 19th century economy model. It's like if Marx had set down, I mean, you've got these machines and vintages of machines, but there's no information economy. There's no financial sector doing speculation. So there's a lot of missing pieces in that model still. And okay, that just means we have a lot of stuff to do. I think the point I would disagree philosophically was the remark you made at the end, Andrea, about predicting and estimating models. That's not a useful thing to do. So I disagree on that. I think Alex Brazier disagreed, and I think we saw a real contrast between the financial system models for both Rama and Alyssa were showing models that were really calibrated in a very detailed way and were really trying to be overtly realistic, versus your model, which was trying to capture the essential elements, the key elements in economy, so you could do some qualitative policy experiments. Both are valuable. But I don't think we should stop there. I really think we need to keep pushing till we can do the same in the macroeconomy, because I don't think the financial economy is innately more suited for that than the real economy. We need to do it in both places, and we need to couple those models together. I guess my view, the word I'm using in the book I'm writing is verisimilitude. That is, there's been a philosophy that's been used as an excuse, I would argue, in economics since the time of Milton Friedman, that goes under the phrase always issued in quotes, as if. And while I agree with Milton Friedman that ultimately any model should be judged based on their predictive value, the predictive power of economic models, and I mean predictive power, I don't mean doing a regression and putting 3 stars next to a coefficient, which in my experience running a hedge fund don't mean shit, okay? What means something is you divide the data in half, you fit all the model, all the parameters on half of the data, and you predict your next year, and then you inch forward and you re-estimate all the parameters, and you inch forward a year, and you really try to pretend that you're doing what you have to do to predict the future. And even then you're overfitting the data, because if you do that, as soon as you do it more than once, you're now jumping in your time machine to redo it. But it's still way better than just doing regressions. Far more reliable. Because you can really trick yourself with regression. So, sorry, tangent. But back to Milton Friedman and as if, I mean, it's getting good predictive results in economics, they're few and far between. So we really have to grasp at all the straws we can hang on to. And one good straw to start by grasping at is to make the model as realistic as we can. Now, I don't mean putting in every little detail. I just mean having assumptions that are plausible and make sense and match what's happening in the real world, that you can go out and do experiments with and show that people in experiments actually follow the decision rules that the agents in your model are making, that you have the most important features of the economy in your model, so you're not leaving out something like default or the whole financial system, and really trying to make models that kind of look and feel like the real thing without making them flight simulators that are trying to mimic every little detail. As Einstein said, you want a model to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so I think that's the direction we have to go. I guess I like, my vision to connect to Domenico's talk. Well, and the thing I would like to see, I mean, I've had this debate with Kars as well. I would propose an experiment to Kars Hummus, who Domenico worked with and was your mentor at some point in the past. And Kars would say, well, we can't do that because you have to have a rational expectations equilibrium around which you can do the experiment. Screw that. I mean, it's not realistic to start with. Let's do experiments that actually look at the real stuff that we care about. What I want is a realistic agent-based model where that has the main moving parts of the economy in it, where we can, as I was saying to Giulia, you can unplug a decision-making module in your model and put some real people making that decision, and you can compare to see how they make that decision in exactly the same context that your decision-making algorithm is making the decision. In fact, you could unplug all of the modules at once and put people in all the modules and see how they made the decisions. Well, maybe not quite. I mean, if you look at something like household savings, I think you actually have to do that with real people. I have no idea how I would save in a model, but have no idea how I decide to save in real life either. But okay. Now, so I really think we need to be pushing toward that, and I think the big block is, well, there's two big blocks. One is having enough financial support to try and do these kind of things at the proper scale. But the other one is data. And this is where I think we really need to get better action from policymakers and governments. Because on one hand, I'm all for protecting confidentiality of private individuals, but we need more data to be transparently out there so we actually have a map of how the economy works. One of, I think, the biggest problems in economics, we haven't even bothered to draw a map at anything but the coarser scale of resolution. As soon as you try to zoom in to see how does economics actually work, the map goes blank because we don't know anything anymore. We aren't collecting the data because it's all siloed up or nobody's even making the effort. And I think that goes back to the fact that, you know, the Nobel Prize winning macroeconomists who would have had the influence to do that kind of thing haven't had the vision to make granular models, and they haven't put pressure on the governments and the agencies to actually collect the data and make it available so those kind of models can be built. And I think that's what we really are going to have. Or, you know, what we may have to do is actually squeeze the data out of various commercial sectors. You use satellite imagery and, you know, lading, what do they call it, shipping labels, lading records from shipping. And you use all these other kind of data sets you can get to try and get what you need. Because ultimately, I really think we need to move towards a granular model or competing granular models of the economy that really have a high degree of verisimilitude, where we can verify the decision-making algorithms in experiments, where our benchmark isn't some equilibrium that's probably silly to start with, and where we can actually really get realistic models of the economy. And I finished 45 seconds early.
Excellent timing. I'm not sure I'm going to be quite so slick on the timing. So look, the only thing, my main reflection is that I feel very sad and sorry that I wasn't here for the whole day. And apologies, Angus, but I couldn't get away. But just from hearing the short snippets and the pieces from the panel, it's clear, you know, the work that Angus is doing. I just want to say, from a policymaker's perspective, there really is a huge demand. And actually, I rephrase that, not a huge demand, because I don't think people really know they need it yet. But there is a huge need for this sort of work. I'm going to be here, you know, I can talk less about, as it were, teaching you how to do your work, but I will definitely, you know, ask more than I can say. And I wanted to give you sort of 4 kinds of questions that we're grappling with, where, you know, I don't think the current modelling and the current approaches quite satisfy us. You know, and an invitation to anyone who wants to work in these areas to come and, you know, work with us on this sort of thing. You know, at a high level, just first of all, I know the title is looking at macroeconomic policy. Foreign policy very much is macroeconomic policy. It's just not the UK's macroeconomic policy. It is the macroeconomic policy of every single country that we care about and that we work with. And so we do a lot of macroeconomics, global macro, but it's not about the UK's macro. It is about what the other countries' cost functions and response functions and impacts are. So I want to sort of pose 4 questions. 1 short run, 1 long run, 1 with rich data, 1 or richer data, 1 with poorer data. And to get your I'd be very interested in the discussion and responses around. So first on short run questions. One of the things that we are constantly asked by ministers about is to form a judgment on the economic stability of a particular region. You hear a shock in the papers, or it could be the Middle East, it could be Latin America, it could be debt crises, it could be military intervention, it could be all different kinds of shocks. And we are constantly asked, can you try and model for us what the knock-on impact of this will be on XYZ country? You know, what is the tipping point for Lebanon? What is the tipping point for Iran? We'll come back to Iran in a moment, as it's a slightly different case. At what point should we be really worried about contagion, and in what order will it knock on through Latin America in a particular area? The conventional models will, often spew out what you put into them and how you calibrate them, and you can kind of tell before you've almost asked the question what the answer is. And they're useful and they're helpful, and they stop you making very silly mistakes. And I think there's still value in them at the moment. But one of the things I will take away from today, even this short period, is the policy flight simulator that you talked about. That's really what we want as well. We want to sit there and tweak variables and say, well, what if this particular thing happened here? How does that have a knock-on impact? And by continuously playing with variables in a much more interactive way, you can get to a much better solution around what you think really is the relative stability of a region. What order will the impact run through in a particular country? I don't want it to necessarily tell me, inverted commas, the answer. In fact, I know that it's not going to. I just want it to tell me in a richer way the sensitivities. And at the moment, using conventional models, it's effectively, I get the Monte Carlo simulations of different parameters and variables, and it's not quite what I'm looking for in terms of understanding the sensitivity of different variables. The second is a long-run question. So whereas the instability is often a short-run question, a long-run question, when we are thinking about how we engage with India, how we engage with China, sort of big economies, what we're not interested in is, the IMF forecast for the next 2 to 3 years. We want to know, what will India look like in 30 years' time? In 2047, 100 years after independence, what is India going to be? Economic models out that far, not particularly helpful. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing any modelling, and you shouldn't be doing any estimation here. One of the I'll share briefly our current solution to it, but I don't think it's, inverted commas, as good as it can be, and I think there's scope for the complexity analysis around it. So at the moment, we will often use either an in-house or an outside long-term forecast as a baseline. We'll analyse the assumptions around it, we'll analyse what the parameters around it are, and then we will sit down in a group and we'll brainstorm, what do we think of the 3 or 4 major scenario permutations around this? And essentially just using that baseline forecast, as it were, that you just say 4% growth, whatever it says. It could be as good as a straight line extrapolation, but a sensible one. And then you go, well, what does it take for it to be 2%? What does it take for it to be 8%? And what does it take for it to be 15%? And you sit down and you describe those scenarios to yourself over that length of time, and then you can bring in your expert judgment that then says, well, I think that scenario feels like a 20%, and that feels more like 30%, and that feels like basically 0. So, when the minister thinks India's going to boom and become, China within a 30-year horizon, we kind of know that's not really going to happen. But we do know we've got a good sense of what we think needs to happen and come together over 30 years for India to do as well as it possibly can, and what our probability is attached to that. Now, that's a reasonable quid pro quo in the absence of kind of modelling, but I can't help but feel that there is something that complexity modelling can offer us, even in that sort of longer term scenario and situation. I may be wrong, but it's a question to ask, and it's where I think our current modelling lets us down a little bit. Then on the data rich and the data poor side, on the data, slightly, I call it data rich, but it's got relatively reasonable amount of data, is looking at global trade flows. It is very much the fun thing to do of the day. Everyone all of a sudden has become a trade expert and a trade economist. But again, it's one of those areas it's very similar to your wage example. You want to be able to dig down and drill up. You want to be able to pull a module out. I loved how you talked about pulling a module out and just putting some people in and some expert judgment. I've just always thought that our economic models just do not allow enough for expert judgment coming into things. And our best way to bring that judgment is you calibrate a parameter and you tell a parameter, I want you to be X. But it feels to me like there's a bit more that we can do around that. And so I think just how we model trade flows, and I won't cover the ground that Eric did, but you could take that wage example and just sort of stick it in and think about trade flows in exactly the same way. And then in terms of sort of data poor environments, for me, one of the main questions is around impact of sanctions. And it's an environment where, again, conventional models don't quite work. You try and simulate something, you say that's roughly the equivalent to this particular kind of shock, but not really. And being able, and also you, especially on macro, often our sanctions are often not against the most pleasant economies in the world or with the most reliant data sources, and we have to use hybrid data sources. You mentioned satellite photography. I've sort of written it down before. How can I get a model that works a little more interactively, that plugs into alternative data sources around newspaper reporting of riots, around container flows to countries that shouldn't be accepting container flows, around flows across a particular path to a particular country that we know we should be worried about, that we can monitor. But how do we then in real time feed that through, or not even in real time, but in something close to a month or two, feed that through into a number that we can feed back to ministries. So those are my sort of questions, and then I put on top of that a couple of overlaying notes. The first is, if you're developing complexity models, you do need to find a way of getting the language and the way to communicate that right to policymakers. So much is, what picture can you draw? How can you describe the confidence you have around your analysis to a minister in a way that gives them the right level of confidence? Not too much, not too little. How do you involve them in that risk-sharing process? And that has to come. You do need to think about how you're going to describe that if you want to have an impact with the analysis that you're doing in a policy world. The second is around data, and you talked about data shouldn't be confidential. I think often when we work, in particular in the areas we work, we're fine with sharing particular types of data with partners. What we're often less happy about is sharing the results of the analysis much more broadly and publishing our results, because often a lot of what we do is precisely about national security interests and the rest, and just by telling someone what I think India is going to be like in a few years is, often undermines a lot of the work that we might do as a response to that. And then third is the sense of, as we, as a community, build up our complexity models, thinking about how they interact with each other, and how does the economics evolve so that there is consistency between models. We often talk about macro models with micro underpinnings. What is the and modelling in particular specific agents and the rest of it? But what is the theory and the architecture which is going to allow us to do so? Because if I think about those four questions, I would like to have models that spew out reasonably consistent answers, or at least at some point I'll get asked about trade flows and I'll get asked about sanctions, and I don't want to say, well, they're totally different. The results from one are totally not comparable with the other. It would be nice. It's a wish. So those would be my three things, to overlay those four questions: communication, confidentiality, results, but it's probably unique to the Foreign Office, and then something around consistency of the modelling. But I'm going to pause that.
That's perfect. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we have plenty of time for some questions. We have some any questions we'd like to ask, but before we do, can I just start off with one question? Giulia, I was very interested in your summary about trial and error policy making, and once one allows for feedback, it seems almost inevitable that you get into this world of as much as policymakers like to have either a rule to guide them because it's a sort of safety blanket, and they can always say, look, that's why I did it. Actually, because we can learn from you, you get stuck into this trial and error. Is that just the inevitable doom of policy making, that as much as you might search for a rule, there are no rules?
Yeah, and I certainly think this is really important to understand, that one has to be realistic about what policymaking can really achieve, and just to perhaps touch on some of the points you raised when you said, I would like to understand about the shock, what kind of shock I need to knock on the system. But in fact, if you have a complex system, the shock sometimes is irrelevant, and it's the system which is intrinsically unstable, and they undergo phase transition, and this is not really necessarily driven by the shock. And also, when you say I would like to have a flight simulator and change the parameters and see how the system reacts. So in some cases, that's this system have a phase transition, and the phase transition is driven by an external parameter. So certainly, by changing the parameter, you may understand a lot about in which region is stable and which region is unstable. But sometimes they are self-organized critically, so they bring themselves into critical state in an endogenous way, and is not really fine-tuning an external parameter that creates the criticality of the system. So again, that is very path-dependent. So any policy needs to be path-dependent, because a policy that is valid today, as the system evolves on a path, that policy may have a completely different effect on the system. That's where the experimentation comes from. It needs to be adjusted depending on what is the path that the system has followed.
So just following up on that, I mean, our government, well, not this one in particular, but over the last 20 years, we've loved monetary policy rules and fiscal rules. They insist on having rules.
Yeah. Based on one variable, usually.
Which is an interesting sort of tragedy of policy making, in a sense. Alan, you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to first of all make a remark. As I was sitting here, I realised we were talking about heterogeneity and how this hasn't really been incorporated. And I think you mentioned that, Doyne, or somebody talked about it. And it just occurred to me that with Mauro Galagati, I set up a thing called Workshops on Economies with Heterogeneous Interacting Agents. And it's 25 years that that's been running in all sorts of different countries. And I was just thinking, pretty unsuccessful in some sense. 25 years, and that's what we got. That was my first thought. Second thought was about your scenarios. You say, well, people sit together and and they look at scenarios and they say, well, how's this and what do we think, judgment and so forth. But apparently before the 2008 crisis, there was an exercise of this sort, and people were asked to discuss various scenarios. And one of them was complete collapse of the financial system. And so somebody said, well, right, now here's what did you find? So nobody looked at that one. Yeah. They thought that scenario was of zero interest. So that's another dangerous scenario. People don't believe it's going to happen. And then I had a last remark, but I forgot what it was. So, yes, I forgot. Give the word to somebody else.
Yes, Andrea.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment which links basically what you Doyne said and also what Eric was saying. Because of course, I think it was not enough clear. I think you need a different level of model. So I guess that once you go to a much more precise forecast or this kind of thing, you need a very detailed model. And in that I perfectly agree with you. You really need microdata and so on. This is also what is happening now in macroeconomics. You have more or less simple model, and then central bank develop much more sophisticated model. What I was trying to say is that already with simple agent-based model like mine or what we were discussing, you can do quite a lot of stuff. For instance, Eric was talking about this puzzling thing about it's difficult to explain why minimum wage is not depressing economy. And you can also add to that, there was a recent paper by the experience of minimum wage in Germany where they find that is also spurring productivity because people move from low productivity firm to high productivity firm. All these results we already have in our agent-based model. We have extended with the labor market. We have different institutions, as you said. You can have more rigid or more Anglo-Saxon market vis-a-vis European one. You can have minimum wage and so on. And we are able to uncover all these possible results. That is, if you have the minimum wage, this is going to improve the economy, not only because you have higher aggregate demand, but also because you spur firms to be more productive and more innovative, and this also can have a long-term impact. So I think you need two levels of agent-based models, simpler, a little bit more complex for the policymaker to do the analysis.
Any reflections from
No, I completely agree, and I think, it's a heterogeneous world, and that's part of why we have many researchers pursuing in different directions, and building on each other. I mean, in fact, what was it, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we had this conference where we got a bunch of the agent-based modelers together. You were one of the initiators to try and build a common framework.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is an example where if we had support, we could, because there was a high level of enthusiasm for this in the room. Problem is you have to get funding for it. And then the funding, you can't just go and say, look, we can solve everything if you give us this framework, money to build a framework. No, you have to root it on this specific thing, and then you end up not being able to build the framework, and plus you don't get the grant in the end. So, but yeah, you know, it'd be great if we had interchangeable parts, so that we could just plug different pieces of models together. Because as it stands, it's a very balkanized research world, which is terrible because it's a small research world to start with, but every group has their own set of code, and because they had to write it all themselves, and it would be a giant project to integrate with the other guys, we're all just going along in our balkanized silos. So this is an example where the right kind of funding could make a gigantic difference.
Yeah, this question of details and levels is a very good one, and the answer is it actually depends on the question you're asking, and you know, Kumar gave some examples of different questions where you probably would approach it with very different levels of detail. So, you know, if you're looking at some specific issue of trade, you might use all that micro data on, you know, what's happening in the fishing sector and auto parts or whatever. But if you're asking some bigger kind of macro dynamic question, you know, it would be natural to simplify. The climate community has done a good job. The physical science climate community has done a good job of creating model architectures that are fairly flexible. You know, and Doyne mentioned the ability to kind of swap in and out modules and also kind of work at different levels depending on what the question is. If you're looking at, you know, some specific dynamics of clouds or, you know, ocean thermal transfer, you may get quite down in the weeds. But if you're looking at more macro stuff, you know, you can lift up. But the key thing, which economics hasn't done, is those different levels are conciliant with each other. They're not in conflict, and they link up. So you can, you know, move through your questions and system at different levels. Whereas in, you know, economics, you know, we have little micro models of things that are completely disconnected from any of our more macro models.
Yes. So this provokes quite a comment from Kristen. Why don't we have that economics? Because we don't have this world out there that we observe. We're part of it.
Yeah.
All models are ideological.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Defend certain interests. Yeah? So you have the people who want free markets, the people who want more government laws for unionization or not. So it's all very political. So we will never get there, and because it's not possible, because we have these ideological rifts in society, and also as scientists we represent them, and so it's not possible. We will never get there. So.
Well, do you want to disagree first?
I'll be interested to see whether we disagree in our disagreement.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Tony.
Well, I don't agree. I mean, I think that the whole goal should be to get to more objective models. I view my role is not to tell people what's good for them or what's bad for them. My role is to say, if you make this choice, it will lead to this outcome. If you make this other choice, it'll lead to that other outcome. And then say, which outcome do you prefer? My humble role as a scientist is to do that. Not to tell them what outcome they should prefer in advance. And so I just think better science would allow us to do that. Science is about connecting cause and effect. And we should really factor that out from the ideology. And I think one of the big advantages of complexity economics is it's well suited to that. You know, economics, standard mainstream economics has baked into it selfish utility maximization. That's a very strong ideological statement. And it's a testable empirical statement, and it doesn't test very well. Okay? So I say, let's go look and see what people actually do in the lab. Let's put that into our models, and then let's see what will happen given the way people are. You know, what outcomes we collectively go to under these choices or those choices. And that's where we should be heading. So I disagree that it's not possible.
So I'll offer a slightly different view. So you actually make a very important philosophical point. Unlike physics, where the rules are kind of out there to be discovered, in economic systems we make the rules. the rules of the game in terms of our institutions, policies. Now, there are some deep regularities in the economic system that arise out of human behavior and just kind of general properties of complex systems and networks and things like that. But it is a different kind of system, than a purely physical system. So, what we believe in matters. In my minimum wage example, because for a long time we believed the minimum wage was bad because of these oversimplified models, large numbers of countries didn't raise them and they declined in real terms. But that kind of capturing of this sort of changing of the rules, changing behavior, the feedback with decision making is something that equilibrium models can never capture, because it's not an equilibrium phenomena. It's a dynamic, reflexive feedback phenomenon. So part of what we're arguing for is models that can actually capture that. So we can see, if we change our policies, if we change our beliefs in something, how may that work its way through the system and feed back reflexively. And can we, it does offer an opportunity to make things less ideological, because we can actually understand in a deeper way the consequences of this thinking and decision. Keynes always said his dream was for economics to be as boring as dentistry. I don't think we'll ever quite there, because there's always issues of power and politics and things like that. But I think these kinds of modeling can, take some of the heat out of what are ideological questions because we just don't know, and to Doyne's point, give us a sounder basis to make decisions on.
And put some teeth in the economic models.
You should just add that Piketty's latest book, which is no doubt going to be another great seller, 1,000 pages, is all about ideologies and the roles that they have and the way we develop them. So I think
I don't disagree with that.
We're sort of halfway between, because ideologies are built into the assumptions that people make in their models. And on the other hand, you might say, well, we want to get rid of that. But we have to remember that that's how the world is functioning.
If I could clarify, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of ideology. I mean, ideology is a major thing, and I think actually we should model ideology, because that's an evolving complex system unto its own. And I actually have now 4 students that are modeling opinion dynamics and ideology. So we're not getting rid of that. I'm just saying, as scientists, we should factor out the ideology from the science part. And we should look at how the ideology influences expectations. I didn't disagree with anything Eric said. But I do think there are certain components of economics, like supply and demand, are very strong forces. And there are some invariants in economics that have to do with the mechanics of the way the system works, that you can guide to some extent with behavior and opinions and so on. And to some extent, there's some wins you can't fight.
Kumar, you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to very quickly say, sort of talk about why it is actually not just interesting but important to be able to have complex systems modeled properly, that talk about the macro but have really sort of detailed, specific underpinnings. When you're engaging, if you're engaging ministers with your macro analysis, and they're absolutely capable, of making judgments based on it, but it can often feel very abstract. And if you say it's an X% impact on trade or an Y% impact on GDP, these are numbers we've become familiar with, but in reality, what does that mean? And in particular, when you want to then communicate a decision or engage the public on that decision, that's really unhelpful number. You want to talk about jobs, you want to talk about the profitability of a given sector. And until you can sort of link those two things together, and you want to talk about the profitability of that sector in Hartlepool, and have some sense that might be right. So it's not just sort of interest, but I think in order to improve and continue to improve the quality of decision making, which is the key here, having models that have that richness and consistency is really important. Lisa.
Just following on from the discussions, I wonder, we're talking about, we're kind of looking for the model, the kind of super model. Are we actually missing maybe an institution? And just like to Kumar's point about what will the Indian economy look like in 30 years? Who has got oversight of what the UK economy as a whole will look like in 30 years. We've got the Bank of England focusing on monetary policy, Treasury on spending, academics, coming up to their own model. That we're maybe missing an institution to help with that stability, that oversight that kind of, looks at all these issues and takes the ideology and politics actually out of it and gives us a bit of stability.
Oh, that's what NICE does.
The economics, but other areas like quality of life, like, kind of a bit broader. Just in terms of foresight, I suppose, like this, is foresight in terms of different scenarios and different options and different routes, so sort of foresight in institutions.
Maybe I'll just elaborate on that a little bit, if I may try. So, three of the panelists are professors at universities. And so saying there's no money, I mean, we put a lot of money in tertiary education in this country. It's how you spend it, I think. But Dominic Cummings came out with this extraordinary job spec saying, hey, if you're weird and you've got some really brilliant ideas that are different, come and see me. But the response from many in the academic community was, it's terrible, he doesn't understand anything, which struck me as extremely defensive. And whatever you think about this person, that's not the issue. It's just not the issue. This could be anybody saying that. The question posed, why are our institutions, particularly education institutions, not responding in different ways to the challenges that these people face, like the hard to call person and so on? They seem impervious to what's going on in the world, and I don't get this really.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Both Doyne and I read that blog post, and in many ways we were quite pleasantly, was somebody asking the questions that should be asked, and it clearly done a fair bit of background reading and knowledge, and was talking about the things we've been talking about in this room. So it was, hearing that coming from a very senior position in government was very encouraging, that there's at least some awareness somewhere in the giant beast of government that, these methods exist and can be used. Now it's a whole another set of questions as to, what's the best way to get those methods into government and make them effective and so on. I think, the reaction you're talking about, some of it was probably just, political and so on. But some of it was, the same kind of resistance we get when, one of Doyne's bright young postdocs puts an article to a traditional journal. And even though it's, all about economics, they'll send a reply back saying this isn't economics because it doesn't have utility maximizing agents, optimizing something. So, there is a lot of inertia and resistance. But the way the optimistic side of me says that economics is getting reinvented, but it's getting reinvented kind of around the economics departments. There are people in the econ departments who are doing this stuff or sympathetic to it, but there's a lot of interesting action going on in psychology departments, in computer science departments, in business schools, schools of government, and so on. But you're right, there is a lot of inertia.
Doyne, you want to say?
Well, it was fascinating that Dominic Cummings did that, and my reaction was, well, it's frustrating. I just wish, if it weren't Satan, I would consider collaborating. But, I'm not sure I want to help the UK. What?
You're the non-ideological scientist, yeah.
Well, no, okay, I'm acting here as a person, I do have a vision of where I want the UK to go, and I don't think it's his vision. But it was frustrating because, I immediately got an email from my colleagues at SFI saying it's as if he'd gone down the roster of all the lectures at the SFI summer school, complex system summer school. Those were the papers he was quoting. And it's scary that those guys are actually thinking about that stuff and getting serious about using it, and the other guys don't seem to be. So,
Rasputin was very clever.
what?
Rasputin was
Yeah.
very clever.
Yes.
In Germany, you have that kind of institution, sort of. You have these 5 wise professors who give their take on where the German economy will go. And you also have these, I think, after 6 months, they give their report, and then the other half, another half year, and then the 5 most important economic research institutes give their reports. So you have that kind of institution there, but it's highly ideological. Yeah? You always have this minority vote in there. So you have that 1 out of the 5 who's more on the left, and sort of, and also in the institutes you have the ones that represent more the employer view, more the union view, and then you even for the time you had from the radical left a sort of the memorandum group, sort of a radical sort of critique of that of these reports. So that's where my skepticism comes from a little bit, because from my country of origin, where you have this more Hegelian view of the overview state, and the state sort of encompasses us all, and sort of a more, but it doesn't seem to work that way.
If I could just make, I think the two things are very coupled. If you have very low quality models, so they actually don't do much good, then you fall back on ideology. Ideology is a heuristic, right? It's a simple way to say, I just have a rule for how I'm going to make my decisions, so you can make a quick decision. And you know, if the models get better, then that can start to change. And I think, you know, you've seen it in weather for 100 years. Weather forecasts had roughly the same accuracy. They were all made subjectively. So it wasn't until 1980, actually, that physical weather models that have been under development for 30 years became good enough to compete with the subjective weather forecasting models. And then since then, weather forecasts get better at a rate of every 10 years, the forecast 1 day ahead, or n days ahead, becomes equal to the forecast n plus 1 days ahead 10 years earlier. So it's on a very clear trajectory now for the last 40 years. But I think that could change. We'll see. Maybe people will always bend everything to their goals and nothing else, but I think if we start to have models that actually consistently make better forecasts, then I think we would see a change in the sociology.
I was tempted to write Cummings and say we've got the biggest collection of weirdos in the UK in our group at Oxford.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to say something off the cuff about the ideology is harder to combat than you think. Scientists, I've heard a lot of talks today, different people making assumptions. Most of the time you're not aware you're making an assumption. You're just not aware of it. And so the challenge is whether you can get enough genuine empirical data back to challenge your assumption. And this is to close that loop is dramatically difficult in economics. Yeah. So you have to question yourself. You have to be more self-questioning. It's the only way to close the loop faster. So I sympathise with people who think that's difficult.
That is difficult.
I want to side with him because that's exactly right. You know, I had an old co-author, Bernard Hildenbrand, big general equilibrium specialist. So when he gave up general equilibrium after the results in the 70s and said, I'm going to do something else. And he said, the problem is all our assumptions about how people behave are based on the introspection of economists, not based on observation of how people work. So we should give that up, and I'm just going to work on data about household data about how people behave and look at the distribution of that and see if I can reason from that. And he gave talks on this in the States, and it was received with extreme negativity. You know, I mean, places where he used to be a hero, Berkeley, Harvard, they loved it before, they hated it when it came. And finally he said, why don't you like my new work? And what did they say? Werner, you're destroying our human capital. You know, our human capital is deeply embedded, you know, all the assumptions we make, and we think of them as not being sort of questionable. They're just normal. Those assumptions about behavior and preferences and so on, but they're not normal. They're things that we put in there.
Yeah.
I think maybe an optimistic comment though, the example Eric gave is a perfect example of the minimum wage. When Card and Kruger did start questioning the assumptions about minimum wage, they then took it to the data, and then in time that data influenced the policy. So it may need to be one policy at a time, but I think there's a pattern there that when we question assumptions, it doesn't have to disintegrate.
It would be great if you're right, but you know, the OECD, we see the American delegate who says, Nick Hanna came from the guy who promoted $15 minimum wage in Seattle and gave a talk. And the American delegate said, you know, you're going to destroy the economy, man, if you keep on trying to do things like that. So it's very deeply embedded, and that's just pure prejudice.
just on that, because I've been working closely with Nick actually on this, and they've done a lot of follow-up studies on what happened is Seattle is kind of an experiment. You know, we talked about doing policy by experiment, and Seattle has not fallen into the sea. In fact, it's booming along. But the problem we run into, and a reason why, again, we need these models is our boldness and ability to experiment is very limited unless we understand the system. So, you know, Kumar talked about, you know, as a policymaker, you don't necessarily want forecasts, but you want the kind of understanding to then know what your options are and make your experiments more intelligent.
Yeah.
You know, on the minimum wage, you know, we're not going to experiment with very, very high minimum wages because, you know, we don't know what the consequences are. But if we looked at them in models, we might have an idea of how high might we try to experiment. Or, you know, other policies, you know, for example, on, you know, regulating markets or climate change. So part of the goal of these kind of models is to actually give you, you know, change the space of thinking, give you new ideas that you will then try out in the real world. You'll never get it always right, but your odds get higher.
Can I come back to this question of trial and error? Because we're supposed to be, you know, looking at policy making here, and I'm just intrigued that the idea that although policymakers want and insist on having rules, the feedback loops suggest actually people would learn how to respond to the rules and therefore undermine whatever it is you're trying to do. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists, you know, a very simple question is, if you were advising economic ministers in the broader sense, would you suggest that actually maybe we shouldn't have an inflation target or a fiscal policy target? Would you go down that route, or would you say actually there's too many trade-offs of not having these targets, you're better off keeping them anyway?
Do you want to start?
Looking at you, Joe. That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Think for a second. I mean, sorry.
Sorry,
You know, blurred out top line. But you know, rules can be very. I mean, they are very useful things. I mean, they constrain the behavior of a system and they introduce some regularity into the system. And part of the, you know, this is why we have institutions and rules in the first place, because there's parts of the state space where you don't want to go, and you want to create some guardrails around it. I mean, I think the concern, Angus, you were implying earlier, is we've kind of put those guardrails using one dimension, and that may create some rigidities which are not helpful. So where I think these models would be hugely useful is you know, not coming up necessarily with simplistic rules, but can you create some kind of heuristics and guidelines, maybe in multiple dimensions, of where we want to be in the monetary state space that would be really useful to, you know, to the MPC in a way that the current, I mean, because right now the monetary rules are kind of plucked out of thin air, if we're honest.
Yeah, yeah. Giulia, Doyne?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually really think that this idea that you can control the economy using one variable is a little bit thinking the economy is like a car and you are like a mechanic and you pull a lever and you know, you can create a kind of reaction in the system, and I don't really think that is possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean that policymakers don't have a role to play, but the role I can see is more in trying to make sure that systems are more resilient to potential shocks, and not shocks, but, you know, to the fact, you know, accept that this system will be susceptible to crisis and you know, some kind of big unpredictable kind of event, and trying to make them more more resilient to this kind of situation, rather than try and control very closely the behavior of the system. So yeah, in a way I would say that that's not really.
So I'm glad I let my colleagues go first because they gave eloquent answers. But just I think rules can be a very good thing. Rules are nice because then they're predictable, they're consistent, you know what they're going to do. But I completely agreed with what Giulia and Eric said, that, you know, the simplistic rules, we can do better. Now, just to say that these things do make a difference, or suggest it makes a difference, is not a proof. But the U.S., you know, there was not a central bank until 1913. And leading up till that, if you just go through the record, every 7 years on average, there was a financial crisis in the U.S. and some of them were pretty bad. And so the economy was just doing crazy stuff. After the Fed formed in 1913, there have been, depending on exactly what you count, around 4, so maybe that's once every 23 years, is I think what I backed out. But on the other hand, we've had a couple that were real doozies, right? The Depression was a big one, bigger than any event before. And then the crisis of 2008, which probably would have been really big if they hadn't improvised a solution. Now, it goes back to Alyssa's talk this morning. It seems a lot better to me to have a set of rules in place that have anticipated the possibility of crisis, so you have a driving manual when you hit the crisis that you've kind of agreed on with some powers to work, rather than having to have, Hank Paulson gathering all the bankers in a room and, spending the whole weekend yelling at them to get them to do something that nobody even knew if it was going to work or not. Nobody had any idea what layman's connections to everything. I mean, at least now we've got a lot more data. But to get to my main point, I think it's really a multi-dimensional space, and you want to have a bunch of different levers to turn. My friend John Giannakopoulos has been saying for 20 years now that in addition to interest rates, we ought to systematically regulate collateral, because collateral is just as important in the whole process, and it has a different effect. And when you get down to the zero bound, you can't regulate interest rates anymore, but you can still regulate collateral. And actually, when you look at, and by the way, I recommend anybody that wants to think about this kind of stuff, this book by Adam Tooze called Crashed, goes through in great detail, in 600 pages that are hard to read, goes through in great detail how the crisis reverberated around the 10 years leading up and the 10 years after. And what you see is it was really complicated. Simple little Taylor rules aren't going to get you there at all for guiding through that. That some of the responses worked pretty well. The US did sort of okay. Of course, we got massive inequality and maybe populism as Donald Trump as a result. But the Chinese did a pretty good job. Europe did a terrible job. Angela Merkel did a terrible job. Now, of course, partly it was because the German populace wouldn't let her do a better job, but she and Schäuble didn't understand what was really going on. And how profound the consequences of their dissembling was in causing the whole mess to go on for a decade. And so, but just to say that I think it's a complex world. We need lots of controls. We need to really understand how they all work. And it's a lot more complicated than driving a car, which is already complicated enough.
I think from my experiences, I'm quite a fan of rules, actually. If you think about, in particular at the aggregate macro level, so one level we've said rules are overly simplistic, but they perform a number of functions. One is around constraining behaviour, and actually ministers will say they find that helpful given the number of parameters and pressures that they have in the decisions that they need to make. The second is it helps with communication. A lot of what we're talking about complexity, these are really complex systems. Being able to communicate to the public that here's one rule, this is why, this is a reaction function that you can expect, I think is incredibly helpful. And then the third, again, this point was mentioned before, is around it helps with stability and understanding. And if you had no rules and no guidance, you've got a lot of volatility and a lot of space and a lot more unpredictability to work with. That said, it's not, and because the rules are simple, there's actually quite a lot of freedom and flex around them, more than people think in terms of what you can do to adjust those. The thing that I would say is that you don't need rules for absolutely everything, and actually I think the UK is pretty good in particular in its regulatory environment. You look at financial services, which you all know, we're far more principles-based than we are rules-based. And actually that is reflected in a lot of other sectors as well. And I think the more granular you get, then definitely, I think principles are just so much better at capturing the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So actually I think it's not yet time, I think, to sort of completely sort of discount rules. I think in particular over the last 10, 20 years, I think they've performed quite a helpful function and a useful function in bringing sort of stability to sort of macro policy. But these are all things to debate. And Angus can buy me a drink.
We'll see how we start with that. This gentleman next, and then back.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was going to ask about one area where sort of large-scale simulations are already used for macro policy decision making. That's in energy sector modeling. So IPCC climate transition scenarios or the Iyer World Energy Model use very large-scale simulations to, for instance, predict the appropriate level of carbon prices that we need and what the changes in the energy sector are. So this may be a long shot, but I was just wondering, firstly, to what extent are models used by that community different from that we've talked about today? And perhaps if they're not too dissimilar, what can be learned from the impact that they're having in the policy world?
Okay, this time going you up first.
I can, yeah. So, I mean, what you say is true. Those models, they're large, complex models, but they're computable general equilibrium models. I don't believe anything that those models say. And they have a terrible they have never back tested those models. They've never had the courage to do what I suggest you should do, which is try and forecast something and see whether they're right. And in fact, it's not even clear that means anything because they assume all this optimal behavior, which we don't actually observe. One of the biggest problems with those models is they have not done a good job of grounding their assumptions about technological change. And actually the IEA, because they have, well, I'll back up a little bit. They have made forecasts for things like deployment of solar energy. They've incorrect, and when you look at it, they've been, and because 20 years have passed since they started making those forecasts, and we can see they're just systematically wrong. Every time you get to actually validate a forecast, it's bad, and they just get worse and worse. And they keep bringing them up, but they're still systematically low. So on one hand, I think it's a good example where we need detailed modeling. I think it's an example where CG models won't do the job. That we have the Cambridge econometrics model over there, which I think does a better job. But we need more diverse points of view in the way that's done, and we need to keep score of how well people do and believe the people that do better. By the way, I forecast 10 years ago that solar energy was going to be at the price level it is now, and so I think I have a little more credit.
So I would just briefly add that I agree with everything Doyne said about the energy models and the economic models used in energy and climate. But the physical climate models are a different story.
Yeah.
Those are really kind of agent-based models where the agents are, however many square meters of atmosphere, or ocean that they're talking about. But they have, dynamics in them. They can work at multiple scales. They have a lot of empirical, data built into them. So they provide an interesting model for, or some inspiration at least for where we could go on economics. But we have this situation where we have these actually, quite good and continually getting better physical climate models married to these awful economic models. And we have a project with a group of others to actually, try to fix that and start building some integrated assessment model using complex systems techniques.
Yeah, so just very quickly on that. So the fifth question that I had written down, but I didn't say because 4 sounded like a better number, and I had 2 with both, short run, long run. But the fifth was climate change, and I couldn't agree more that you've got very sophisticated climate models, and then the economics and the way that that's sort of built up, and it just isn't keeping sort of pace with it. But we have what we have right now, and the invitation to all of you is. Please, quickly, because as I say, there isn't a demand, but there's a need. And it's until we're able to show people what good and or better looks like, they're not going to necessarily demand it. So please don't hang around and wait for people to sort of pull it out of you. You're going to have to just sort of trust what you're saying in this conference today. You build it, it will come.
Sorry, I was just thinking to add, may I actually add something on what you said before, rather than question?
Of course, yes.
Okay, so basically, the first thing was the rules. Okay, and what Don said, basically, that US did much better. Well, there actually was a conference here about 8 years ago when actually two central bankers, one from the UK, one from the US, and discussing what let's say actions were more beneficial and what actually the outcome was better. And one of the results was that yes, US could have done much better work, but they also, I think, had a much higher leverage and ability to put a much bigger and much more aggressive in their quantitative easing policies, to call it this way. Particularly because the US dollar is much bigger reserve currency in the world, so it's much more acceptable. So this is one. But as far as the rules are concerned, actually, there was a group on the working on the ESG models, and we actually it was a kind of monetary fiscal policy EU project. Some of the UK universities, including mine, were involved in it. And also, I did some work on that. So the outcome was that, but I think it's good to have a balance of the two. So one would be, at least at the time, we found that yes, you have a monetary policy continuing with standard rule, for example, based on inflation and maybe growth. But to balance it off with a fiscal policy rule introduced based on unemployment, similar rule to a title rule, but unemployment as a factor driving the fiscal spending and balancing the so basically in case of higher unemployment, for example, doing some more kind of fiscal, shall I say, intervention and expansionary investment rather than relying on monetary policy doing everything. So the balance of the two actually provides much better utilization of the economic resources. That's what we found. So if you want, I can give some more of that.
Can I just because somebody who's sort of involved at the time in the crisis, I cannot resist. I mean, I just keep falling into this trap every time, but I can't help myself, so I'll do it again. The history of the UK financial crisis, there was never a review of it, what actually happened, and the response largely got written by one or two institutions, but excluded from every single report is by far the biggest policy intervention, which never gets mentioned. You have to work very hard to find it. It was £340 billion at the time, which was nearly a third of our GDP, called the Asset Protection Scheme. And we went out to insure these toxic assets, but it's not QE. The first round of QE, I think, was either 25 or 50 billion, 340 here. But it's excluded from people's story. It's extraordinary how it just disappeared. But that was the intervention.
How did it work, Angus? What did they do?
So it was actually interesting. It was based on a paper by Caballero and a paper, I think there's another MIT guy. So it started off as it was an insurance scheme. So we took the view that these so-called toxic assets, mortgage-backed securities and so on, that they couldn't possibly be that the underlying assets, which we now knew what they were, a large part, there was Spanish car parks and stuff chucked in, couldn't be that priced that low. So there was some panic reason or limited participation reason for these prices being so out of fair value. And so we said, well, we will buy all of these at a certain price. The total of these is about 340 billion, but we're going to take our time to work out exactly what the strike price is for these things, which is really us using the fact that we're the government or not as force, which in these conditions you can. But by providing that insurance, all of a sudden you said, so you're not going to get a bust. Okay, fine. And you can almost see that the bank's stock prices going up the next day, and that's the event. Just by saying it, you didn't even do anything for 6 months. You just said it. You just said, we're the state, and actually we understand our responsibility in these crises to transfer the risk back. And funnily enough, the UK did have big enough pockets to be able to do this, even with its outsized banking system. Sorry, come on then, Eric.
So just one thing on that. So Angus and I we didn't quite overlap at the Treasury. So I was at number 10 during the financial crisis. You were at the Treasury. When I then went to the Treasury, one of my last jobs there was to be the last board member of the Asset Protection Agency. So I was the Treasury's representative on that board and wound it up at the end. It was a phenomenally profitable intervention. The UK government made, I think, literally hundreds of millions of pounds from it. There were other bits of interventions, less profitable, but it was an insurance scheme that never had to pay out. But it was an enormous risk to take. So you're absolutely right. I think it's one of the great successes that people don't talk anywhere near enough about, but it was profitable.
I was just going to note a very similar story in the U.S. on TARP, and I was involved in some discussions on that during the Obama transition. And there were there were expectations on Treasury that there was going to be big payouts from this, but just the existence of the program and the first round of stress tests, which gave, even though there's lots of deficiencies in stress tests, as I'm sure you heard earlier, but just the fact they hadn't done that before, that changed the psychology. So it wasn't the expected effect of the policy; it was actually kind of an unintended effect. Do you know what the other big policy that really worked was? Also buried, no one talks about it.
Making the Fed backstopping euro dollars effectively, right? The Fed made credit lines available to international banks in dollars.
The swap lines was definitely up there as well. But the one I was thinking of was the payroll tax cut.
Absolutely.
Because that unlike the monetary tools, which take forever to kind of work their way through the system, that was an immediate sort of adrenaline shot into the economy, and there's been some good backward studies now showing that was.
We had in this country we had a temporary VAT cut.
Yeah.
We actually had a fiscal stimulus.
Yeah.
Didn't last long. Changed the government, but anyway, we did. Now it's
And
just
there was cash for clunkers. I thought you were going to say cash for clunkers.
I shouldn't resist going into that history. Can I just finish off this session just with a little, a summary of where we are in terms of the Rebuilding Macro project, and to say a little bit about this prize that we are launching. So one of the great pleasures of being director of Rebuilding Macro is I get to meet lots of interesting people like today, but pick from different subjects. And yesterday I was with Dame Henrietta Moore, who's probably one of the leading sociologists over the last 30 years in this country. She's a wonderful woman. And so we started talking about this picture on a wall, and it was of primitive people. It was a picture. Rutgers, I think I pronounced that right, in New York State, put together what they thought was an East Africa village from archaeological remains. So it's the first attempt to recreate what life was like from the archaeological remains. And so they had animals and humans and so on. And so the question is, what do you think these humans were doing? As far back as we can tell from these remains, which is a wonderful sort of thing. And they're all in groups. They're in groups having what look to be some sort of sharing of something, and there's kids, and then you have other people hunting in groups as well. But what you see in all of these humans, you have no people walking on their own. They're all in these groups. So that is really, and Doyne knows this very well from being on our management group, we have people, psychologists and anthropologists, who come at this from a very different perspective. And so one of the core areas that we're moving down to in terms of our, what's going to be our recommendations is that we have to get away from this idea that agents in the economy only interact indirectly through market prices. That's not good enough. That they can actually interact in other ways, such as we have people influencing other people's expectations through heuristics and so on. So the first thing is that we have to move away from this very simplistic way of atomistic agents. That's not at all in the nature of what makes us human beings. It's just fundamentally different. It's not a sort of discussion point. Every other subject and what we know about humans is different. The second is that there's that sort of interaction is not necessarily in a transactional way between atomistic agents. We know that we interact and influence each other's preferences. And that is the sacred cow of so much of economics. But there was a great debate back in the 70s between Sen and Hirschman on one side and Stigler and Becker on the other, I think it was. And this idea of parsimony won the day, because the idea that values get adjusted is difficult. But parsimony has to be revisited in terms of the technology we've got. And times have moved on, and we've gone beyond a pencil and paper. And so maybe we have to think about, well, what is the most parsimonious? Because as Doyne said, that Einstein quote is very good. You know, simple enough, but no simpler. The question is, what is no simpler now? Where is that boundary? So I think that's going to lead us into new areas. And the third aspect is about technology and this endogenous process of technology, which is normally assumed to be an exogenous shock. And this is probably the bit that we haven't done as much as we'd like to so far. So we'll be looking at some projects in this area as well. And so when we start recognizing these, you know, if we're missing something other than just U of C, you know, it's not just about consumption, there's something else about humanity, then we've lost our welfare theorems, which is a bit of a problem because that's kind of the cornerstone of everything. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about the discussions today is in economics is this really sort of dirty secret. I think it was Lipsey and Lancaster in their Theory of Second Best paper. Once you have two or more market failures, removing one of them, there's no economics to suggest that's going to lead to a better social outcome. So what do, given that we clearly live in a world with at least a couple of market failures? Well, what do? What's the prescription? And you know, we kind of ignore that and said, no, we're in a perfect world and we'll just move away from it rather than starting that imperfect world. But starting from that imperfect world with some of the sort of approach we discussed today can be a much more honest way of actually giving people policy advice. So with those thoughts, and final point is that, you know, the big three challenges we face today, whatever it is about globalization, international trade, that's not in main macro models. So trade theory and macro models live in different silos, which is just remarkable. So all of the issues of comparative advantage, income inequality, the Stolper-Samuelson, they're not in a macro model, which I just find breathtaking, given that's the question of the last 30 years. The second, financial stability, we've discussed already today. But the third is technology that's in front of us all. You know, that's an exogenous shock, apparently. I mean, these are the big three areas we have to understand more if we're to fill our job, and we're lucky enough to get public funding for this, of helping policymakers make things better for our society. So in keeping with that, we've been carrying out a few experiments. What is the best way to encourage research? So the typical way is you write up a call, which is difficult because you don't want to exclude anything. You know, how do you include it enough? How do you give enough direction? It's kind of hard. We found out some interesting findings about what types of people respond to different ones. So that's difficult. And then when you've done that, people write an application where you have to read it and sort of try and second guess what they're trying to do. And already it's very narrow before you decide to give them, you know, £50,000 or £60,000. So we thought this is probably a very inefficient way of doing this. And Penny, I have to actually thank Penny at the OECD meeting last year. We were having a discussion about what we should do. And she suggested a prize. So this is a bit trickier because people, when you give prizes, they think, no, this is academic work we're after, it's not bingo. We can't just go down that route. So it's a bit tricky to persuade people that this is actually legitimate. So we have a prize that we're putting forward, and the amounts involved I always forget, but there's three prizes. The total prize money is £20,000 for the best paper in complexity. Oh, here we go. First prize is £12,000, second £5,000, and third £3,000. The deadline is September 2020. I think it's 10,000 words is the limit. And the rules are all on the website. We have 6 judges. I because I'm the PI of Rebuilding Macro, I get to be the ultimate arbiter of the time or something like that. But it's never had to be exercised so far. The judges are Doyne, Eric.
No, I'm not a judge.
Oh, I thought
I withdrew.
Well, we have practiced rules on a recusal, so Eric would as well.
Okay. Well,
So
I didn't
you don't
realize.
have to worry about this.
I didn't realize I was a judge.
So
Okay.
one of the things we had to figure out in Rebuilding Macro is how do you have enough rules to avoid any accusation of favoritism. So we have stronger rules than the ESRC. We are, painfully careful about this, and we'll continue to be, actually, so you'll be fine, but you obviously, any of your students can't rule on, and any of your students can't rule on, or even anything indirect.
We'll talk later.
Okay. So we're going to have, and Alan has very kindly agreed to be a judge. Isabel Saleh, is it, at University of Amsterdam? Sal at University of Amsterdam, and Caroline Weisner in Bristol.
Isabel is at the Bank of Canada.
Oh, she moved.
No,
She
well,
has
yeah, a
always-
while ago,
while
like
ago,
2 years
but,
ago.
yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to, is she? Okay.
Bank of
We'll have
Canada.
to reconsider that, being so far away. We're going to have 5 judges. And the rules are all on the website. I hope people find it an attractive someone. We're allowed to advertise this internationally as well. So hopefully the OECD can help us market this, because all we're interested in is the quality of research that gets done. That's our only motivation. And so, Penny, thank you very much indeed for the great idea. And with that, can I thank the panel, but also all of the speakers today for giving fantastic presentations. I found them all extremely clear. There's something, the word complexity might lead you to think you're going to get very complex presentations, but they were beautifully clear. They really were beautifully clear. So thank you very much indeed for the presentations, and for all of you giving up the time today. And I think we have some refreshments next door for you to enjoy.
Great.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
Thank
you,
you.
Agnes.
Thank you.